Let's think then about a couple of particular views. I want to contrast the view of Descartes, who we've discussed before, and that of Sigmund Freud, who we'll be discussing in the next mini MOOC in this series. Descartes, as you know, thinks of himself as he looks inside in the second meditation, and he says he thinks of himself as a thinking being, a res cogitans in the Latin, a thing that is essentially one that thinks, whose nature is to cogitate, as it were. He realizes that he's closely bound up with his physical body, but he doesn't think that he's identical with it. That's the upshot of his dualistic argument. And he thinks that, it seems, he can get a deep understanding of his own nature by just introspecting on the contents of his mind and about the operations that he sees occurring inside of his mind, and infers from that that his nature is that of a thinking thing. That's something that has a certain kind of resonance, but you might also find, especially in the current climate and current sensibilities with our understanding of neuroscience and other developments and a posteriori types of reasoning, we might find ourselves thinking that that's at best a limited view about the self. Here's another that's still not quite up to date, but a view that opposes it fairly directly is that of Sigmund Freud, who hold that much of our nature is not actually open to introspection, first of all, and secondly, consists in things that are perhaps upsetting to find out about and not easy to bring up to the surface and let out into the open and be aware of, because at the unconscious level, deep buried within ourselves, are powerful, unacknowledged drives towards, in particular, rampant sexuality and rampant violence. And Freud will hold that it's those urges inside of us that cause us to behave in the ways that we do, but also help explain why we put up with the bounds of civilization in the way that we do, because otherwise things will go badly, otherwise things will become chaotic, there will be lots of carnage, destruction, and unhappiness all around. So we need to keep them locked up downstairs, as it were. The result, though, is that for Freud, we can't find out about our nature by introspecting in the way that Descartes might have thought. We can only find out about our nature, at least we'll have a chance of doing so, if we can engage in some empirical investigation. So whereas Descartes, we can understand ourselves and our own natures in an a priori way. For someone like Freud and many who follow him, if not agreeing with him in the particular details, will in general agree that our nature is something that is best understood not by introspective means, but rather by extrospective means, by looking outside and seeing what we do from a, so to speak, third-person perspective. Unlike Descartes, Freud will use what I'll be calling inference to the best explanation. That is, we find a body of data in our behavior, the behavior of others, and we argue that the best way to explain that body of data is by positing an aspect of our nature that is in some sense buried within. We look at that, we understand it, and if we can develop a satisfactory theory of how that all works and why it does, then we'll understand our nature, but not by looking inside. So one thing that's significant about this is that there are important strands in thinking about human nature that do not depend upon introspection, but rather depend upon an investigation of ourselves in ways that are nevertheless extrospective. So just as I can learn about myself, for example, my weight, not by introspecting, but by standing on a scale, Freud's going to say you can also learn about yourself by taking a third-person perspective on your own behavior. It helps to talk to other people and listen to what they've got to say about you. But in principle, you could set up enough video cameras and other recording devices to find out about how you behave in a way that's observable to others, including you, and thereby develop theories that explain why you do the things that you do. And furthermore, the warning that you might not very much like what you find. And a third view, we've talked about Plato already, a third view that's worth putting on the table as well is that of Plato, according to whom the soul, as he'll put it, is divided into three different parts: the appetitive, the rational, and the spirited. The rational part of the soul corresponds largely to Descartes' way of thinking about himself. The rational part of the soul is the part of the soul that thinks, cogitates, reasons, predicts, explains, and so forth, and should, all else being equal, be able to control the other parts. The appetitive has to do largely with satisfying the needs of the body. So hunger, sexual desire, thirst, etc. There's no reason to think that Plato would hold that the appetitive ought to be squelched and starved, either literally or metaphorically, needs to be satisfied, but it should not take control of the self. If it does, your life will go badly, in the sense that your appetites will guide you and lead to bad choices in ways that you could probably predict. And then likewise, the spirited is a part of the soul for Plato that doesn't have a straightforward analog in contemporary theories about the self, but the spirited has to do with our social standing, our relations to one another. So for example, it's the spirited part of the soul that makes a person yearn for success, achievement, respect. It's the spirited part of the soul out of which pride grows, for example. Presumably also the spirited part of the soul for Plato out of which shame can grow when you've done something that you perceive to be a violation of social norms. So Plato will hold that there too, pride, for example, if it becomes too powerful and thereby allowing the spirited part of the soul to take over, will also make your life go badly because you'll be too hung up on pride. You'll be too worried about what people think about you. You'll be too concerned with impressing others. And so there's a way in which the spirited part of the soul can cause your life to go less well than it might otherwise do. So Plato will hold that the soul has three different parts. And the rational ought to be in control, but not completely strangling the other two, but rather keep them in place, keep them in check, allow them to fulfill their needs. A certain amount of pride and a certain amount of susceptibility to shame, for example, is something Plato would probably say is appropriate, is not out of line, but don't let them or likewise the appetites get too much control over you, otherwise your life will not go very well. As you can see, Plato is especially concerned in understanding the tripartition of the soul, in thinking about how to make our lives go in a way that we find satisfactory in order to help us achieve some form of happiness overall. Whereas Descartes is not specifically concerned with that. He's concerned more specifically with knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge and the development of a rigorous science. Freud is probably trying to do both at the same time, in the sense of trying to think about not just a theoretical understanding of ourselves, but also helping people to cope better with the world around them. So we've got three quite famous, quite influential theories about the self that all have implications for our understanding of human nature. You can decide what you think is the most plausible among these, but I also want you to consider, even if some of them might seem a little bit quaint, for example, Plato's tripartition, what analogs it might have to our contemporary ways of thinking about ourselves, our contemporary questions that we might have about ourselves, and whether or not these analogs can shed some light on otherwise difficult questions.